Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 74 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have lost 4-2. Now, the other night against the St. Louis Blues, I talked about how the Blues were one of the very few teams in the NHL who had yet to have beaten the San Jose Sharks this season. Well, Seattle is one of those other teams as well, with only one prior matchup between them prior to tonight. It was a Sharks shutout victory. In fact, their only shutout victory up until the other night's game against the St. Louis Blues that defeated Seattle. And with no other matchups there, the Sharks indeed undefeated against this team. But unlike the Blues, who squandered their opportunity and are now 0-2 against the San Jose Sharks this year, Seattle were not going to let the same thing happen. In fact, they came out with a vengeance immediately on the first shift, as they would make it 1-0 Seattle within just the first 30 seconds of this game. And the Sharks recently, over their past few games, have struggled in the first period with getting heavily outshot, and in the early parts of this first period, it seemed to be going that direction again. Within just the first few minutes of this game, the Seattle Kraken were completely controlling the pace. The Sharks were left with a grand total of 0 shots on the board. However, as the first period wore on, the Sharks actually started to get some chances, but unfortunately for them, the Kraken continued to get chances of their own as well, and they would make it 2-0 Seattle with a goal from Bjorkstrand. After that, the Sharks would have a power play where Fabian Zetterlund would nail an insane snipe. I didn't even notice that this puck actually went into the net until they actually sort of had the goal horn going and everything like that, because of just how fast it ended up getting shot. But it cut the lead in half to make it 2-1 Seattle. But then the Kraken were not done in this first period, adding one from Shane Wright, getting called up pretty recently here, a former high overall pick from a couple of years ago, his first of the season, to make it 3-1 Seattle at the end of the first period. In the second period, the Sharks would actually manage to score and leave the Kraken with nothing. This one coming from Klim Kostin, as he continues to have some solid offensive output since arriving for the San Jose Sharks at the trade deadline of this year, and so it was a 3-2 game by the end of the second period. However, as we know, the third period has been a thorn in the side of the San Jose Sharks pretty much the entirety of this season, though that could be said about literally every period. But most recently, over the past month, the Sharks have just been getting heavily outplayed in the third periods of these games. And this one, while slightly different, since they only ended up giving up an empty net goal, it was kind of more of the same still, as San Jose, besides a couple of chances here or there, found themselves relinquishing more chances than they actually found themselves generating. And as per usual for San Jose, when it comes down to the last 2 or 3 minutes and they've got the goaltender pulled, they just completely look lost. In fact, they couldn't even get the zone time well enough to pull the goalie until about 45 seconds remaining in the third period. And once that happened, besides one small amount of offensive zone time and pressure that they had, if you could really even call it that, it was relatively simple for the Seattle Kraken to get this empty netter and to put this game away by a score of 4-2. So once again, the Sharks, even though this is a close game on the scoreboard, they obviously would have liked to put up a better effort in attempting to tie this one up, but instead they're left losing in regulation. And so that 4-0 win against St. Louis a couple of nights ago was a nice change of pace from the losing that they have been doing a lot of very recently and pretty much the entirety of this season. But now it's kind of just back to the regular scheduled programming with a regulation loss. Moving on to the players to talk about, before I actually get to the lines, I do want to talk about a bit of news coming out of San Jose earlier. Actually, there were a couple of things, though one of them I won't really harp on here in this video just because it's kind of unrelated to the game. But first of all, Philip Bystedt gets signed over or brought over from Sweden to the San Jose Barracuda. He's going to be able to finish out the rest of that season with them, so that's going to be interesting to see. But the other bit of news, maybe more relevant here to the San Jose Sharks, is that Jack Studnicka ends up getting called up to the main squad. Now, he does not actually end up dressing here tonight, and so perhaps I'm going to be getting slightly upset about absolutely nothing if he never actually ends up getting back into the lineup. But I found it particularly odd that with now 8 games remaining on the schedule after tonight's game, that the Sharks, their best option or their best choice of calling up from the Barracuda to get some players some reps in a games that pretty much do not really matter here at the end of the season is a player who is not only not really a prospect for the San Jose Sharks, but actually got a relatively sizable handful of games in the earlier parts of this year. Studnicka is having some okay success with the Barracuda, but he was brought over to play in the NHL, and after about, I think, 9 games there, him going scoreless and really not making much of an impact, he's been stapled with the minor league team ever since, and it just feels as though there are other better and more interesting options to be rewarded calling up to the main squad. The big one that obviously stands out is Danil Gushchin, was called up for 2 games last season, and he was a point per game over that stint. He had 2 games this season where he put up an assist, which is already more points than Studnicka had in his 9-game stint. And then on top of that, in the AHL, he's almost a point per game player. You could argue for sure that when it comes to Studnicka, well, you can play him sort of in the bottom 6. You can't really do the same thing when it comes to Danil Gushchin. I can understand that, but then you could also just play Gushchin in the top 6. It's not as though Justin Bailey is such a amazing option for that particular role. But on the other hand, you could also go with someone like Ethan Cardwell, who is a 20-goal scorer as a rookie in the AHL, and he absolutely could be played in the bottom 6. So again, this might be me getting bent out of shape over no reason, because Studnicka does not dress here. He could end up getting sent right back to the Barracuda tomorrow. We do not know, but it just feels like that is an extremely odd choice to call up when we're in this point where you're trying to get some of these younger players some actual NHL reps. Anyhow, moving on indeed to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Kostin. This was definitely the Sharks' best line of the night, featuring their best player of the night, who I must say has to be Mikael Granlund. He had some really, really good shifts, got to show off his skill. It's always kind of a coin flip when it comes to this top line. The fact is that when you line up against pretty much every other NHL team, top line versus top line, Mikael Granlund, Zetterlund, and Kostin as a trio don't exactly jump off the page and are pretty much outskilled by most other top lines in the NHL, which makes it difficult in a head-to-head matchup to actually make that much of an impact. Here tonight against Seattle, no offense to them, but it is slightly less of a lopsided skill difference between these top lines, which allowed these 3 players to have significantly more freedom on the ice, and Mikael Granlund made pretty good use of that. Obviously, there is not necessarily some massive amount of even strength goals that he managed to score, but it was a very nice pass to Fabian Zetterlund. We saw his winger Kostin actually get a goal as well off of the tip-in from a Mark-Edouard Vlasic shot, so generally very impressed with the top line's performance here tonight. When it comes to the second line, we have Cunnin, Bailey, and Eklund. The standout performer on the second line has to be William Eklund, who I thought was really all over the puck for much of this game. He didn't exactly get a ton done. Obviously, 2 goals here, not really involved besides the power play one. That's not necessarily an even strength thing. But again, as I have mentioned in the past, it's hard to do a ton when your line mates are Luke Cunnin and Justin Bailey. So while I would say both of those players, Cunnin and Bailey, they had some decent games for what they are expected to be able to do, for the average level of a second liner in the NHL, it clearly leaves a lot to be desired. So Eklund is kind of on an island a bit, having to do his own thing individually, and I thought he actually came out pretty well with that. But again, it's hard to expect tons and tons of points to rack up, and this is more so a moment for over these last 8 games for Eklund to really hone his performance as a top 6 player in the NHL and find his own individual level of play instead of trying to compare to point totals that are difficult to amass on one of the worst offensive teams in the entire league. When it comes to the third line, we have Sturm and Bordlow being joined by Zadina. So Zadina getting rewarded for a decent enough game last one against St. Louis, where he also managed to pot a goal, gets pumped up to the third line, and it didn't really work out. Zadina, I don't think, was particularly noticeable at all here tonight, outside of like one chance late in the third period. Generally, I wasn't super impressed with this third line. Bordlow, not super great. Nico Sturm, not exactly doing a ton. So generally, the third line was slightly disappointing, I would say. And then we get to the fourth line. So as I said, since Zadina gets bumped up, someone has to get bumped down. That was Mike Hoffman, as he is joining Ryan Carpenter and Kevin LeBanc on the fourth line. And I must say, I say this a lot, but it is definitely true here tonight. I honestly did not notice that Mike Hoffman was even playing here tonight. I actually, when writing down his name on the board here, I had to make sure that he was even in the game, and then I thought, wait, well, I didn't even see him. Did he get injured in like the first 2 minutes of the first period? Which he did not. He ended up playing about 8 minutes, which was the lowest among forwards for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, but that is still like a notable amount of minutes, just that he really did nothing here tonight, and so that's kind of it. When it comes to his two other players, they were slightly more noticeable. I would say LeBanc had a couple of good shifts, especially in the third period, gave him a couple of good shots that almost managed to go in, but didn't exactly find anything, and generally the fourth line was about average-ish. Then we get to the defensive side of things, the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows. They were quite good the previous night against the St. Louis Blues. Here tonight, on the other hand, the level slightly dropped. They were not massive liabilities, absolutely not, but they had a couple of issues when it came to actually defending in front of their own net. You also look at a couple of the goals that actually managed to get scored here, and you say, hey, was that a bit of a lost lapse of coverage there? Absolutely the case. And so not a terrible game, but also not all that great. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Thrun and Addison remaining together, trying to sort of complement and make themselves better, as both of them have been struggling as of late, but ever since being paired together, they've been much better. Here tonight, I would say they were decent. A small fall-off from what they have been over the last couple of games. I thought Thrun and Addison had some nice moments offensively, which was quite good to see. From a defensive perspective, I also think they were making significantly less mistakes than usual, but still a couple of issues that were creeping into their game. I would say, though, all around relatively positive for what we have seen as of late. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing of Vlasic and Ruda, the expectations are not particularly high for these three players, in particular Ruda, who just had a really rough month of March in general. I actually thought they both looked relatively decent here tonight, so that was nice to see. And then finally we have the goaltender when it comes to Mackenzie Blackwood, a fantastic outing in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues with that shutout victory, so he gets right back between the pipes here tonight against Seattle. Immediately lets in a goal to Matty Beniers. Not necessarily an easy save, I would say, as this one seems to be a bit of a rolling puck and definitely difficult to predict where it would end up going, though not the most impossible save to make either. The Shane Wright one didn't really have much of a chance on that one. The Bjorkstrand one was a really, really good shot. Definitely a tough save, though not impossible. 3 goals let in on the night, obviously not quite at the level of his previous game against St. Louis, but all things considered, not the worst. It just ends up being a loss here for San Jose. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they'll be taking on the Los Angeles Kings. So the Sharks are pretty much going in a row, besides Seattle, I guess, against these teams that are right in that playoff race. It was Minnesota. The other night it was St. Louis, who they really dashed the hopes of with their shutout victory. St. Louis could have really used those 2 points against this very weak San Jose Sharks squad, and now they're going against a Los Angeles Kings team who are just barely holding on to a last place spot in the wild card slot, and we shall see if the Sharks can play spoiler once again. Class dismissed.